Perfect. So, hello and welcome. My name is Christina Lee, and I'm an Android engineer at Pinterest. And today, I'm here to talk to you about Kotlin. And specifically, Kotlin has gained a lot of momentum in the past year, and there are quite a few companies who are using it. Just a few. Square made the first argument that I know of to use Kotlin, and then also people like Trello and the New York Times have done some integration. The New York Times people are in the back, so. And so what I want to talk about today is not necessarily just a basic Kotlin tutorial. And the reason for that is that if you Google that, you're going to find 100,000 results already on the web. And I've given talks about that before. And so today, I kind of want to breeze through the benefits and get straight into the integration. But of course, just to recap, it would be remiss of me not to cover these. Kotlin has a lot of great features. One of them is null safety. You also have things like mutability protections with vals and vars. You get lambdas, and not the same lambdas as Java 8. You get real closures. You have conciseness and an easy readability. There's basically seamless interop with Java, and the reason that is because Kotlin exports Java interfaces. You get smart casting, which means if you type or null check something in Kotlin, it will automatically be able to be used as that type or non-null value later in your code. And you also get a bunch of other features. So that was a quick recap. Again, these are all on the internet, so I don't want to spend too much time in this presentation going over them. What I really want to talk about is things that go beyond the basics, and what my value add here is around adoption costs. Because of course, Pinterest was one of the first big corporations to adopt Kotlin in production. And so as the guinea pig, we've learned a lot, and I'm here to share that with you so that you don't have to suffer in the way that we did. So, 1 year ago, I gave a very similar talk to this one. This is a very awkward picture of me from Droidcon, New York City. I don't know what I was doing in this photo, but it was something that made me smile. And, and what this talk went over was a Kotlin retro exactly like I'm doing today, but there were some differences. So primarily, the app that I was working on at that point in time, it was all Kotlin. I was at a startup of 12 people, 10 to 12 people, and so it meant that when we went to Kotlin, we went all in, and we were able to write the app from scratch. Also, when you have a developer team of only 6 people, it's easy to get people on board, and we don't have the same split dev environment that we do at Pinterest. And last but not least, we had a really easy release cycle. And that was because at a startup, you don't have huge release pipelines. You just build an APK and then push it to the App Store. And if you're really fancy, you do some testing, but that's pretty avant-garde. So a lot has changed since I gave that talk. First and foremost, build times. Back when I gave that talk almost a year ago, that was the top of everybody's mind. And now we just did a profile for the Pinterest app, and it seems like we're spending about 8 seconds in Kotlin for an incremental build, which is not the end of the world, and definitely nothing like it was over a year ago when it was really mission critical. So some other things that have changed, especially with this Pinterest case, is that we have wider adoption. This is not a team of 6 people like at the startup that I was at. It's a team with more than 30 devs. We have way more tools in our app, so we have a lot of dependencies on other libraries and frameworks. The team is constantly growing, so you can't just teach people something once and then expect that to be the end of it. You have people coming and going in the organization constantly. And also, we have to build features that scale to our users. We currently have 150 million monthly users that we support, and that's a little bit different than what I had at my startup, where we were lucky to have, a couple thousand people use our app. So, with that in mind, 3 of our key takeaways this year revolve around people, process, and tooling. And I'm going to go over each of those in turn just to give you a grouping. So let's start with the first, people. What's really key here are these top 3 priorities, which is that you need adoption, you need buy-in, And you need to address recruiting concerns because if any of you work at corporations, this is a really, really big issue that people are going to talk to you about. So, adoption. I've covered this elsewhere, but it's something that really doesn't get enough press. People take for granted that if they introduce Kotlin into their app, others will learn. And that's not really something that you can take for granted. We should be really, really thoughtful in how we introduce Kotlin. And a couple ways you can do this is you can have a few people trial it. You can have devs choose between Kotlin and Java on their own free will, or you can ask everybody to adopt Kotlin at the same time. So a few reasons that we went with the middle option of allowing devs to choose for themselves whether they use Java or Kotlin is that organic growth is really, really powerful. When you force people to adopt something that they're not excited about, I guarantee they will find everything wrong with that technology that exists. They're going to be really, really good at finding the difficulties because they're going to look for them because they're not excited. So organic growth is really powerful because when people choose to do something on their own, they bring excitement with them. Further, those people who are most excited, they're the best guinea pigs because they're willing to bear the costs of a new technology. And we take that for granted, but introducing an entirely new language into a code base means that there are going to be problems. There's no getting around that. There's going to be a point where something breaks or it doesn't work in the way you expect. And the people who have enthusiasm for that language or platform, they're the ones who are going to be able to address that without getting frustrated. Now, of course, I gave you the reasons to do that, but there's also some reasons where having a split code base aren't great. First and foremost, if you leave Java and Kotlin side by side, and I can tell you this from personal experience, Java devs will get frustrated. And the reason they get frustrated is because they have a group of their coworkers running around the app, speaking a language that they don't understand, and mysterious things sometimes go wrong, and they can't fix them because they don't understand that language. So I think we don't give enough weight to interpersonal factors when we adopt new things, but it really is a big consideration, and I've seen this happen many times. Also, the practical consideration of the fact that you have split tooling. If you haven't already thought of it, you need two separate lints because Kotlin is not written in the same way as Java. The lint rules for Java are very, very different from the ones that we have in Kotlin. And this point about non-reproducible errors, the reason I added that is because when you have devs working primarily in two different setups, not environments, they're all within Android Studio, but they're different setups, one mostly Kotlin, one tooled for Java. Sometimes people have errors that you can't reproduce, and that's because I work entirely in Kotlin, and so I don't see this thing that happens over in the Java files, or vice versa. And this can be really frustrating when you have a large dev team that people are saying, I have this problem, and you're over here, and you can't reproduce it, so you really can't help them with it. Okay, buy-in. This one I think is the easiest now, primarily because of that first slide that I showed you where we have all of these big name companies toying with Kotlin. Once the big name companies adopted Kotlin, it got much, much easier to sell this to smaller companies. But with that said, here are some things that I've picked up in trying to get Pinterest to move enthusiastically towards Kotlin. The first one, speak enthusiastically. People need a reason to love a language, and I can't overemphasize how much excitement gets you. So you can sit there and tell people that null safety is great and that mutability protections really make your code quality better, but at the end of the day, you need to get people on board, and talking through semantics, it doesn't do that. And so if you have someone on your team and you believe strongly that you want to use Kotlin, you need to sell that. You need to think of yourself as a salesperson, and you need to drum up the enthusiasm required to get people through the hard times. Further, you need to be willing to take responsibility. This is something that I learned very intimately during Pinterest transition to Kotlin, which is that if you're going to be the proponent for a new language, you better be willing to be on call as well. And that's not very glorious, and it's kind of work that people don't really want to do. But as the proponent, you also need to be the owner, and you need to take on the debt of fixing builds when they break or speeding up build times if Kotlin is slowing them down. Lastly, I think that it's really, really beneficial to point out use cases. And I was trying to figure out how to do this when I first came to Pinterest, because to me, everything in the world is better when it's written in Kotlin. But of course, if you're a Java dev, that's not necessarily the case. And so I came across as a little bit too pushy sometimes, that Kotlin was always the right solution. And what I've learned in the last 2 years of using Kotlin is that it's a lot more productive to say, here's a problem that we're talking about right now. If I were in Kotlin, this is a way I would solve it. I'm not sure how to do that same thing in Java, but this is the approach that I can take. Can we replicate that? And that sort of gentle nudging of, here's a way that I would be able to do this in a very easy fashion in this language, it's very illustrative of the gains without telling people, you're wrong for using Java, you need to switch immediately, everything that you're doing is just not okay. That's obviously not a good way to get friends. So gently pointing out these use cases without expecting people to switch is a good way to have this dialogue, and I found it to be exceedingly effective in a large team environment. Okay, recruiting. I got so much pushback about recruiting because people said, nobody's going to want to work here. You're using Kotlin and they don't know that language. And also, it's already so hard to hire Android devs. Now you're going to make our pool even smaller by asking us to recruit with this special language. And what I want to say to address that point and the conversations that I had with our recruiting team is that we actually come away with 3 wins from Kotlin. First is advertising. Kotlin has been an amazing asset to our technical brand. We have always struggled at Pinterest to communicate what we're interested in, why. And without even having to raise a finger, our use of this language messages to the world that we care about strong typing and null safety and the good, clean code that comes along with those tools. Second, Kotlin enthusiasm is a really good indicator that the person you're interviewing likes to keep up with the times. And that's just a good indicator for a successful employee in general. If new libraries are coming out and changes are happening and people are resistant to those changes, it's going to be hard for them to keep up with the Android databases and codebases and all of these things that are coming out. And so this is really a positive indicator of a willingness to learn. It doesn't mean that all devs that are good are Kotlin users or are interested in Kotlin, but it is a good indicator. And lastly, and most importantly, we've seen that introducing Kotlin at Pinterest has given really established and senior devs the ability to learn something new. And smart people, they like to learn. It keeps them busy. When you give them the same problem day after day, they get bored. And bored people, they leave companies. So we've seen that Kotlin has actually been something of a treat to people who otherwise were very well versed in the code base that they were working in. And my favorite moment of this is that my tech lead once messaged me in the middle of the night talking about null safety. And she had put off learning Kotlin for quite a while, and when I got that message from her, I knew that hook, line, and sinker, she was in. She was excited, and she was ready to learn this language. Okay, moving on to that second pillar, process. There's a lot about process that needs to change when you introduce a new language. Here's just a few things: precedence for when and how you use, the integration of your 2 different skill sets between Java devs and Kotlin devs. How do you do code reviews and maintain quality when the quality differs between your different files? And also practical things like linters and style guides. So let's dive into each one of those. Like I said earlier, Pinterest chose the route of letting each developer decide whether they wanted to use Java or whether they wanted to use Kotlin. And I explain the benefits of that and also the drawbacks. And one of those drawbacks is that if you let developers decide when to use which language, you might have a situation where a base class is written in Java, and then someone extends that with Kotlin, and then another dev comes in and extends that extension with Java again. And that's kind of a messy way to have a code base maintained with all of these different intertwined Kotlin and Java layers. There's no technical reason that you can't do that. It works from a technical perspective, but there's something to be desired from a code quality perspective. And so one thing that you should talk about, if you allow people to choose when they write Kotlin, is what is an appropriate time to do that? Is it on a feature where you will be the only developer? Is it okay to do that if you're working on it with someone else who doesn't know Kotlin, et cetera, et cetera? These, again, were conversations that I didn't know to have until 2 years into using Kotlin, so you can learn from my mistakes. Second, you need to have a conversation up front about whether you're going to adopt Kotlin in core code paths. We personally have decided that we're going to start from the outside and work in, not because there's any technical limitations of Kotlin, but because we're risk averse. We have a bunch of users who expect a very high quality app, and we don't want to disappoint them. And so the way that we can be forward thinking and adopt new technologies without exposing our users to that risk is by working from the outside in. So we'll start at the feature level, at the UI level, and slowly but surely we've been moving downward in the layers to base classes and networking, et cetera. This also includes highly optimized code paths. So for instance, we have a single entry point into our app that every single user sees every single session, and it's very, very optimized. We've spent the better part of 6 years optimizing it. And right now, we're not ready to do that in Kotlin. We're not ready to step aside from all of those gains that we've fought hard to pick up over the years and start from scratch with Kotlin. So again, if this is something that you're thinking of adopting, these are really, really good questions to ask yourself and also talk to teammates about. Integration. I know that we're at a technical conference, and again, people don't always prioritize emotions as something at the forefront of their adoption process. But if there's anything I've seen from both companies using Kotlin at them, it's that emotions matter. And when people get frustrated, they put up a wall and they try to shun the new technology. And that's not only bad for them, it's bad for you as their teammate. And so when you integrate Kotlin, managing emotions is core, and like I said, it really helps to meet them in the middle. You don't want to stand there and say, Java sucks, your code quality is terrible, but you do want to make a compelling case. And you want to remember what it's like to have people talk a language that you don't understand. And I'm learning this now, being in Italy. I don't understand much of what is said around me. But it's a very humbling experience to not be able to communicate about a problem. And so if you keep that in mind and you keep that frustration in mind, you'll be much more successful. And what we do here is we always allow people to have an outlet where there is no such thing as a stupid question. So one of my roles at Pinterest is that I'm always on call for teammates to ask me any question that they have about Kotlin. Why do I have to use a question mark when something's null? What does it mean to have a nullable type? Should I use a val or a var, etc.? I get a lot of questions about lambdas too. And so having someone on call so that people always have a resource to go to and they don't feel judged for using that resource has been really, really influential for us. How you manage this in your own company is totally up to you. That's just one thing that we've found. I mention this because almost invariably, when I talk about Kotlin at a conference, people come up and ask me about this. To me, it's a non-issue. And the reason I say that is because I still get code reviews from people who write exclusively in Java. The reason that's possible is because Kotlin is very expressive, but also because even in the cases where they don't understand what is occurring in Kotlin, they ask me and I have a conversation with them, and it it's actually caught bugs. You would be surprised at how many times someone leaves a comment saying, what does this mean? Why is this here? And I've gotten into discussion about it and realized that there was a better way to do things. So we do tag all Kotlin files with a mandatory Kotlin reviewer, just to keep ourselves honest so that we don't push through bad Kotlin just because the reviewers didn't know better. But that's only one person, and we usually require 2 people to approve a diff before we land that branch. And the other is almost always a Java developer, and we've kept high quality, we haven't seen any spike in bugs, etc. So I wanted to mention it because it comes up so much, but I really don't think that code reviews should be a core issue because of the expressiveness of the language and because we've seen that Java devs don't really have problems reviewing this code. Okay, linters and style guides. This is something that you definitely want to address in your process, and we didn't do this until far too late. We've always had Java linters and a Java style guide, but we didn't adopt those in Kotlin for quite a few months after we introduced it to our code base, and we paid the price. And the reason for that is that Kotlin has a very small standard library, but you can do things in many different ways. Just thinking about the nullability case, you can do a let question mark, you can do an if not null and rely on smart casting, and you can also do a host of other things if you wanted to be more verbose. But just between those 2 core choices of using a let to scope a non-null value or using an if check and smart casting, you should probably standardize on which one of those you want to default to. Otherwise, you're going to have them intertwined all over your code depending on who's writing Kotlin. So it's really, really important to have these conversations and have them within your team, because unlike Java, which has been around for decades, Kotlin hasn't. It's been around for, I think, 7 years, but most of that in very early stages. So there are no core styles. People are still discovering this for themselves, which makes it exciting for anyone here who's thinking of adopting Kotlin because you get a say, unlike in Java where everything's been decided. And so this is really a thing that is open for interpretation. And of course, as the years go on, there's probably going to be one style that predominates. But right now, you have a say. And I would encourage everyone to use it by making their own style guide for their company to maintain high quality code. Also a plug here, there's a lot of community chatter around style guides. Again, because it's an unsolved problem, nobody has the solution yet. And so I would encourage you, if you're not sure what your style guide should be, to go into the Kotlin communities and listen to what they're saying. There are a lot of smart people in those communities. They use very well thought out reasons for deciding A over B. And so I think there's a lot to be learned there. And I just want to put in a plug for anyone who's not part of the Kotlin community to go and seek some out online. Okay. As far as tools, I also field a lot of questions about, is Kotlin going to break everything in my app? And the short answer is no. But the longer answer is that it might break some things. And it all depends on how your app is set up. So, for instance, at Pinterest, we've had a few tooling failures, and we've also needed to update our release process. But when I talk to other people, they're not having the same issues that we're having, but they might have a different one, because it's very, very dependent on how you've set up your app. So I hate to do this and to call these out, because, again, this is for Pinterest in particular and may not be applicable to your app. But 2 instances of things that we've struggled with is the parallel builds and also ProGuard. And so ProGuard is pretty easy to get around. When it fails, you can write more rules or you can adjust the rules that you had. But the parallel builds thing was a bit harder to swallow. And that was because we needed to, in the end, turn them off. And of course, everybody here knows that parallel builds are a perf gain, and you can build faster because you're building in parallel. So the fact that we turned this off for a time because we couldn't figure out a way around it, that was one of those costs of Kotlin that you need to be willing to stomach in order to adopt the new language and get all the perks of null safety. Now, I still maintain that it's worth it, but I do want to be pragmatic and let people know that there are some things that will break. Fortunately, we've seen very, very fast response times across tools, especially within Google. A lot of the Google engineers seem to also be Kotlin enthusiasts. And so when things break in Android Studio or with Gradle, we often see fixes come out within days, not weeks. Now, as far as updating our release process, the crux of this matter is that if you have a highly tooled release process, you're probably running that on a different instance, not on a local laptop. And so what happened to us was we built something on our laptop and we updated Android Studio and our plugins and everything worked. And then we pushed that to the back end and we hadn't updated that environment. And so then our Jenkins build was failing because things weren't the same. And we had this big kind of crisis around how do we keep everything in sync when we're updating tooling so often. Also, Kotlin lints, we didn't have them, then we added them, so now things randomly fail because we didn't have that conversation soon enough. And so, those are things that are, again, easy to fix, but they take time out of your day. And if you had had more foresight than I did, it wouldn't be a problem, but it is for us. Also, I just mentioned parallel builds. We're very, very careful about what we build and when because of issues that we've had. And so these are things that with our release process, we had to mirror the updates that we were doing locally. Okay. I just wanted to close out with some open questions that we don't yet have the answer to. So first is that style guide that I touched on. We don't know what the style should be, and we're working on that. And the community is working on it too, but it means that if your boss or manager or company expects a really rigid style guide, they're bound to be disappointed. 1.1 was a huge Kotlin release, and a lot of things changed. So things that we were doing in 1.0, they needed to be updated with 1.1. And this is all to say, Kotlin is not yet stable in terms of saying, here's one way to do it. This will always be the way to do it. All right. The second question is, should we force people to adopt Kotlin or proactively start converting files? I covered earlier that our current method is to let people choose when and where they use Kotlin, but there were costs to that. And the open conversation that I'm having right now with my team is, what is the next step? Do we at some point move away from this developer's choice and into something more standardized? And again, we don't know the answer, but this is a question that I'm meeting with people to figure out, and something that likewise might come up at your company. And then last but not least, how long do we experiment with Kotlin before we call it a success? There are a ton of people who say, well, Kotlin, get back to me in 2 years and tell me what you think about it then. Because of course, there are other languages that people hyped a lot, and then those went by the wayside a few years later. So I can't sit here and guarantee that Kotlin will be a success or that it will be around in 5 years. But that shouldn't paralyze me from moving forward. So one of the things that we're grappling with right now is, what is a metric that we can set at which point we know whether it's okay to keep expanding our usage of Kotlin and whether we're confident with that path going forward. Again, at my startup, this question was really easy to answer because we didn't have people relying on us. At bigger companies that are now adopting Kotlin, this becomes a lot more important. Defining this is a company-by-company choice, so what's important for Pinterest might not be important for Trello or Square or the New York Times, but it is something that needs to be talked about because at some point we either need to go full speed ahead or we need to stick with Java. It's not maintainable over the long haul to have side-by-side code bases. So this is something that we're thinking about, and which I think that everybody should think about before they adopt Kotlin too, as opposed to retroactively. Again, I didn't have the foresight to do it, but y'all can learn from my mistakes. So just wanted to cite a few resources because this was not a talk about Kotlin's basic language features. So to give a shout out to those, I have a few talks that are Kotlin language specific features. when to use them, how to use them, why they're important, etc. I have links to those in here, and also the JetBrains team, they have DevRels who give a lot of talks about Kotlin. Again, if you're interested in the language-specific features as opposed to the adoption, that would be a place to start. And then, of course, Jake Wharton, who was the earliest person I knew to be a proponent of Kotlin, has several Kotlin-specific talks. With that, I'll leave my info up here. That bit.ly link is the link to these slides. They're online now. So if you want to go to bit.ly/Kotlin retro, then that's where you can pick up these slides. And you can click on the links throughout that I've hyperlinked. Also, if anybody has questions or wants to have more conversations around Kotlin, I'm always open to that. So my Twitter handle is @runChristinaRun. And also, if anybody wants to find me at Pinterest, I've linked that too. So I think we have time for questions, maybe.